Glam, Geek, and Gore. And here I am once again in the Champagne Rooms Productions branch office. Hello, welcome. How are you doing? Hello, Dion. Yes. So to our regular people, to our replay crew, Dion and I, we must have gotten our wires crossed, and we both have lives scheduled at the same time. And we have a big overlap in the audience. So definitely a replay crew, you rock. We're definitely going to be keeping you busy with tonight's live. So yeah, so I hope everybody's doing well. Hello, happy Wednesday, happy hump day. Mike. If you know, you know. It's just a commercial. Like, there's nothing that you would know. Hello, welcome. How are we doing? So this is the third of our Pride Chats. It's the second of our Wednesday night Pride Chats. Hello, Mama Champagne. Hello. This is the second of our Wednesday night Pride Chats. It's our third Pride Chat overall. And the first one that we did was on June 1st to kick off Pride. We talked about Queer Theory 101. Last Wednesday, we talked about the history, a lot of the queer activism history and things like that. Sorry, I'm reaching to grab something. I want something that's out of my reach, but I want it. I'm still, as I've been growing out my hair, I'm still getting used to it. And having hair touch my forehead is a weird experience. So I'm just gonna take this little brat and I'm just gonna clip that right out of the way. This looks insane. Hello, Janet. How's it going? We'll see how long we keep it. That looks crazy. But it was starting to bug me, and I was like, I'm just gonna sit here and mess with my hair if I don't get it out of the way. So that's our glamour choice for today. But yes, and their importance to queer activism and queer history. And this week we are going to be talking about, what are we talking about? Sorry, I just got confused for a second. I was watching the chat. We're going to talk about that. We are talking about queer cinema and just horror cinema especially, and also just oh yes, and we're gonna chat for a little bit at the beginning to get things going, just because it's doing that buffering thing that it loves to do. And so if you are here and the buffering, trust me, it drives me crazy too, but it tends to end fairly quickly. So just know that if you find it annoying, I find it annoying too. So, hi everybody. Today turned unexpectedly busy. I'll have to catch the replay. Thanks. I'm very much looking forward. Hello, CJ. Well, we'll be happy to have you on the replay. That'll be lovely. Yes, life sometimes just happens. That is absolutely for real. So, yeah, so tonight we're going to be talking about horror movies and just kind of horror in general, and how horror just by nature is very, very queer. If you hear any of these chin beards that want to be talking about how horror has gone woke, my darling, my sweet summer child, it has been woke. It done been woke for a long time. There is such a strong connection between queerness and horror that we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm very excited about that. In the meantime, before we get started with that, as we're waiting for the whole buffering situation to work itself out, let's talk a little bit about the chat, because I mentioned this in my chat last night as well. But I love checking on the chat, and I love saying hi, and I love that everybody talks to each other and all that kind of stuff. With these Pride Chats, for the rest of June, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the chat, and I'm going to try to say hello to people as they come in and out and everything. But because we have a little bit more of a structured topic, I'm going to be doing less immediate and just immediately breaking from what I'm talking about and going to the chat. We're going to let things sit. We're going to let things simmer. If people have questions, keep the chat up. I absolutely love it. I love to see it. We love the engagement. But if there's anything, sometimes the chats get a little bit misdirected. They kind of go in all different. And when it's just an open chat, when it's just a fun hangout, when it's a cool vibes kind of night, I love that. I'm here for it. And definitely when we get to the end of the video, when we're done with kind of the going through the sort of topic of the evening, that I want to go back and revisit it. But I'm going to try to be a little bit more like Jen Love, my chat idol. I always love Jen Love and the way that she does her lives. And so I'm going to be trying to keep it a little bit more contained to the discussion of what we're going to be talking about today. So just know that, and of course, if people miss this intro, they won't know what's happening. And sorry in advance, but just know that if I'm not as active with the chat, that's why. We're going to get back to it, and I will try to still say hello to people. But yeah, so we will kind of keep that in mind. It's easier when I'm not doing my makeup and I have my glasses on, because I can actually see the chat. It's what, and because like if I was trying to do makeup while doing this, then I'd also have to like constantly be looking forward and like squinting at the screen because I can't see anything. So this will be good. Cross our fingers, knock on wood. It looks like the buffering has sort of sorted itself out. So let's talk about some horror. Let's talk about some queer horror and things like that, because there's so much in queer horror, both in front of the camera and behind the camera. But let's talk about kind of the origins of a lot of this, because really the kind of almost like the creator of the horror that's also a tough word to say, and people sometimes think I'm just saying horror. But the creator of the horror genre was very, very queer and lived a very queer, wild, debauched life. I'm here for it. I love it. And you might be surprised to find out that that is Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. So Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, if you don't know, is the person who wrote Frankenstein. And so she is kind of the creator of horror as a genre, as a popular, like recognized genre, and also science fiction as a genre. With Frankenstein, she kind of created both of those. And also, as I was just talking about not being as involved in the chat, let me also change it to all messages, just so that I don't miss anybody unexpectedly. There we go. And so Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley wrote Frankenstein, and it was with a bunch of friends on an evening, and she had this dream, and they used to get together and like tell each other stories and try to freak each other out and tell horror stories and these kinds of things. And she had a dream that kind of inspired Frankenstein, and she was thinking about like, what is really scary? What is really scary in a way that like goes against the idea of nature, of the natural balance of things. And her idea was that it was a man trying to create life. Obviously, women are the ones who create life. I didn't say that I was going to learn how to talk for this video. I just said that I was going to try to stay on track. So women are the ones who create life. And so this idea of a man trying to circumvent that to create life on his own. And it was very interesting. And the way that Frankenstein is often portrayed is very different from the novel. In the novel, Frankenstein, you know, she told this story and then turned it into a novel. And when she wrote the novel, there was very much, the creature has full human awareness and develops language and becomes, you know, as well-spoken as Victor Frankenstein, and chases him and torments him and murders those that he loves, because he has been created and he has no connections, has no, you know, is sort of this thing that goes against nature. Well, I mean, at the very beginning, we can already see how queerness sort of slips in. And that's kind of the connection of queerness and horror, and why it keeps coming up, is that horror is often about the other, and what is sort of not natural, sort of monstrous. You know, it's taken in a lot of different directions, but it's about things that are the other, things that are not the norm. And so queerness fits very easily into horror. I was watching a documentary, and I forget who he credited this to, but John Carpenter was talking about that there's basically two kinds of horror. If you boil it all down, there's really kind of two kinds of horror, because horror is about the other. And so if you think about like our primordial ancestors, if you think about, you know, going back to times where people were just sitting around a campfire, you know, it was a very different kind of time. And so it was all about like, what do we know? What do we have to be afraid of? And so the two types of horror are, imagine that you and your tribe are sitting around this campfire, and you ask, where is evil? what is evil? Where is evil? Where is it found? How do we protect ourselves from it? And the one version of the story is, you're around this fire, and at some point the light from the fire stops, and the person says, out there, if you go past the light of the fire, that's where evil is. That's where the other is. It lives out in the darkness. It's outside of, we are here. We're safe as long as we're within this light and we're within this area. The other version is they say, where is evil? Where do we protect ourselves? And the person sort of points around the circle and says, evil is here. Evil is among us. And it looks just like us. And we don't always know how to recognize it. And sometimes we don't see it until it's too late. And those are kind of the two versions of horror. Either the horror is completely other and it's completely outside, or horror is within our tribe, is within our group. And the threat, we sometimes don't even see it coming because it's there, but because it looks like us, because it comes in a form that looks familiar, that looks safe, it is able to take advantage of us that way. So those are kind of the two main kind of ways that horror manifests, is either as outside the circle or it's within the circle and it's hidden and it's hard to see. And it sometimes is us. Sometimes it's us. Sometimes we find out that we are the ones who are the nature of horror, that are the keepers of horror. And so that idea of the other, I mean, how many queer people, before they come out as they're closeted and they're looking at the world around them, feel like they are the disguised evil, right? Like, I think a lot of queer people, myself included, grow up feeling like there's something wrong with us, that there's something. I went through a weird religious phase. And it was maybe like fourth grade, and it lasted for a few years, but like in fourth grade specifically, I remember it was right around that time, fourth or fifth grade, because I went to this camp that was like, I went there for like 2 years, and it was basically like Jesus camp, but like not, it was like one step down from that documentary Jesus Camp. And I watched The Omen, and I became convinced that I was the Antichrist. And I spent like a solid month, like internally, like convinced that I was the Antichrist. And then eventually I was able to figure out that, like, the whole thing with the Antichrist is that he's like hooked up. Like, if the Antichrist gets born in, like, living in Bowbells, North Dakota, a town of 450 people at the time, like, that's not exactly not a great way to start and get plans for world domination. So I got over it. Hello, Paul. How you doing? And so, yes, just this kind of strange, like, I had this weird sort of thing, but that was part of it, is this feeling of, like, there were so many times where I felt like I didn't. Yes, thank you. I eventually figured out that I wasn't the Antichrist. I did come to that realization. But yeah, so it was this idea of, like, something is wrong. There's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with how I am. And that's how a lot of queer people grow up, is because we see everybody else just kind of figuring out the rules, and they figure it out very quickly, and they figure it out very easily. And it seems to come very natural for them. Now, I think as we grow up and as we start telling our stories, I think there's a lot of straight people who also feel like they are very policed and very controlled by some of these norms around gender and sexuality. And so absolutely, that's something that other people experience as well. But for queer people, it definitely is something that shapes who we are and shapes how we interact with things. And so it's no wonder that we are drawn to horror and these stories of the other and these things. And what I find very interesting is that in many cases, the other, in some ways, will have these kind of sympathetic elements to them. And so, this story of the other with Frankenstein, he's the other, he's this sort of abomination, but he's also a very sympathetic character. And when he has his final sort of confrontation in the Arctic with Victor Frankenstein, he's like, I'm a monster, but you made me a monster. Like, it's your fault that I'm a monster. And, it's very easy when we think about Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who wrote that book. When you start to, like, dig into the truth of her personal life, it's really very interesting, because she was married to Percy Bysshe Shelley, and he had a sexual romantic relationship with Lord Byron, and they were, it seems like they were kind of some sort of throuple, like those two. She was a little bit of like the beard for those two because they were fucking, but like maybe all of them were fucking. And she also apparently had like a female lover, and that's one of the, like, it's suggested in the history that that's why they left London, is because their lifestyle was sort of, people sort of saw this debauchery and they were like, and it was like there was potential for persecution, and so they left London, and that was part of the reason, was because of this like throuple and other partners, and they were bringing other people in, and it was very like sexually fluid and very, very queer. And of course, she's the mother of horror and sci-fi, and creates Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster. And so other stories at the end of it, we're just people with our own tales. I love that. Yeah, so that is, we're just gonna, there we go. Yeah, so we just, from the very beginnings of the genre, there is, all the like weird trolls are coming in all of a sudden. So we're in a sort of transition part. So let's, we'll do that real quick. But so Mary Shelley, very, very queer. We think about other horror icons, Dracula, Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker is an interesting, there is a documentary series on, Hello Happy, how you doing? On Shudder, called Queer for Fear, and they go into a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of great research and a lot of like stuff to kind of bounce your own research off of and find out more about. But Bram Stoker wrote these letters to Walt Whitman, who was an out gay poet in America. Bram Stoker was he Scottish or Irish? I can't remember. I think he might have been Irish. But he wrote these like love letters, basically love letters, about how, you've reached across the waves and touched my hearts, and all this kind of stuff. And it was very very homoerotic. And he wrote all this kind of stuff. Well, he also was living around the time of Oscar Wilde. And so Oscar Wilde, who was kind of an open secret, the idea of living like openly queer is complicated in earlier parts of history. But Oscar Wilde was very much this sort of dandy character, was very much this sort of rule breaker. And so much of his work, so much of his fiction, his theater, his drama, his, plays and things, there's so much in there that is kind of this queer sensibility, and really kind of pushed against some of those norms. And then, of course, at some point, there was a more conservative turn, and Oscar Wilde went to prison. Yes, Mama Champagne. And so as there was this turn, he was arrested for buggery, which is butt stuff. That's an old-timey term for butt stuff. And so he was arrested, and he did go to jail because he had this option to sort of disavow, and, maybe like, I think he was married, but like to completely disavow and maybe be excommunicated and all that. And he said no, and he went to court, and he did end up going to jail. And Bram Stoker, when that happened, Bram Stoker really kind of like changed his tune, and became very conservative, and would talk about how Oscar Wilde was this great shame. And so you saw this person who went from these letters to Walt Whitman, somebody who's like discovering this thing, sees this other person living this very openly, very blatant, very in your face, and he sees the like reaction and the punishment to that, and becomes this very conservative voice and speaks out very harshly about Oscar Wilde. And so Bram Stoker, but there's so much in Bram Stoker with Dracula. And there are other vampire novels, around that same time, and that also feed into this. But the idea of vampires is very much tied into sex and sensuality. The idea of blood and sharing fluids, and it's always this sort of, the eternal kiss, and you become like this immortal pairing and all this kind of stuff. And so there is this sort of sensuality, but it becomes perverted in Dracula. It becomes this sort of, and so you can see this almost, there are female characters in Dracula, but Dracula is very much about, in some ways, it's about Jonathan Harker. It's about Dracula and his desire for Jonathan Harker. And so, he attacks, his fiance and their friend Lucy and all these other people. But a lot of the core sort of conflict goes back to Dracula and Jonathan Harkness, and there's this kind of stand-in. There's the three vampire brides who sort of tempt Jonathan at one point, and they're sort of stand-ins for Dracula because they're meant to tease him and torture him and break him down, but they're not allowed to have him. Dracula will have him. And so you have to sort of like break him and all that. So there's a lot of like queerness is often kind of below the surface, so that people who aren't looking for it and don't want to look for it, it just kind of passes right by them. And then once you're like thinking about these things, and once that's sort of the lens that you're approaching things, you're like, how did people not see this? Like, how did people not see that this is a big old fucking queer narrative? And so two of the greats of the early like horror, like Mary Shelley, who basically birthed horror as a genre, and then Bram Stoker with Dracula, both of them very queer coded, very queer histories and personas and all this kind of thing. So a lot of that then feeds in. And then our kind of early films, if we think about the early Universal films. So James Whale is director. There was a great movie. There was a book and a movie, Gods and Monsters, which is about the life of James Whale. And James Whale was a director, in the early teens, 20s. And he directed 4 of those big, like, Universal monster movies, including Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. And he worked with this sort of ensemble cast of actors who were very queer, lots of queer, lesbian, gay. The guy who kind of plays Praetorius, who's kind of the like flouncy doctor. The woman, I can't remember her name, who plays, she plays a couple different roles between the films, but she's kind of this very shrill woman, and she kind of leads the mob, and she faints a lot. And she was a lesbian. Una, it's almost on my brain. Una Hagen? That's an acting coach, isn't it? Una something. I don't know. I can't remember. Swiss cheese brain. But so she was queer. There was lots of queer people in this little like ensemble that he worked with. And James Whale himself was, for the time, was living basically as like an out homosexual man. He didn't feel the urge to like try to hide. I don't believe he took a wife. He never tried to he just was living. He had male lovers. The Gods and Monsters kind of explores, there was this younger gardener that he had a relationship with, and Brendan Fraser is in that. It's a lovely Brendan Fraser movie. And so he's this queer perspective and surrounded himself with queer actors and queer creatives, and created these early story, Frankenstein, The Other, The Monster, The Bride of Frankenstein, who I love that one because I love that the whole thing is like, then the monster demands a mate. And so the monster like makes Frankenstein build him a bride. She opens her eyes and is immediately like, and just like hisses at him and is like, no, like I refuse. And it's played by Elsa Lanchester, who is a lesbian. So, they're all just this like, no. And it would rather the whole entire castle be like yeeted into oblivion than to have to like be the mate of this creature. That they were both other, but it still like didn't work. They were both kind of other. They were both sort of out there. And so it's really fascinating, that sort of history. And so that all of that feeds into then the development of the horror genre. And there's a lot of like interesting sexuality stuff when we think about slasher movies. That's I love slashers. Slashers are probably my favorite subgenre of horror. Hello, Charlie. How you doing? And so I love slashers, and that trajectory has a lot of queerness, because slashers, if you're going to understand slashers, and this is sometimes a controversial film, and there are some people who they're just like, no, we have to get rid of it. But if you care about film history, you can't like study the history of horror, and especially the history of slashers and just cinema history, without talking about Hitchcock and without talking about Psycho, because Psycho is really one of those core. Now there is an earlier film from like the 30s that's called, I think it's called 13 Women, which is kind of like the first slasher film, where there's kind of these series of women who are all, I forget, I bought the DVD but I haven't had a chance to watch it, and I read an article that was kind of talking through it, but it's basically this series of women who are all involved with this deception, and one by one they start getting killed off. And so that's kind of thought to be like the earliest like first example of what would become the slasher film, because it's not exactly a slasher film. Psycho isn't exactly a slasher film, but it's kind of the prototype, and it's the thing that like people built first, and then people started like smoothing it and reshaping it, and it becomes the sort of slasher genre. And so with Psycho, what's interesting is that it's complicated because I think sometimes now we have such privilege, and we have, as much as there's like ugliness and evilness in the world, there's so much more awareness of different kinds of identities around sexuality and gender identity, and gender presentation, you know, non-binary and things like that. So gender identity and sexuality, there's so much more nuance, there's so much more. A lot of times any sort of gender variance was often just thought to be a sign of queerness or homosexuality. A lot of times they were sort of conflated when they're not the same thing. They're not the same thing, but they're also not unrelated. All of this is this very complicated thing. You know, a lot of times people will say, especially when they're like trying to create a specific kind of argument about you know, homophobia or transphobia, where people will be very specific to say that like gender identity is not sexual orientation. It's not the same. They are completely separate. And while I understand they are separate things, they are different things, but to act like they are not in any way related or connected is just not accurate. They live on the same block, right? Like they're not the same thing. They have different houses, but they live on the same block. They're in the zip code, right? Like all their kids are going to the same school. And so it's because they are connected. And I can see why sometimes it is sort of politically convenient for people to make the argument that sexuality and gender presentation are absolute, or gender identity are absolutely different things. Because actually in Psycho we're going to talk about gender presentation and how that complicates the whole thing, but gender and sexual identity and gender identity are different things. And I get that, and I get that urge to want to be like, these are completely separate, they are not the same. And it's like, but they are intertwined. And so, you know, one place where I really kind of thought where this kind of helped with me was Robin Oakes, who is a fantastic speaker on bisexuality. And we have had her to UND's campus back when I used to be involved with the campus group through my undergrad and graduate school, and even as a community member. We had Robin Oakes several times, and she is a fantastic speaker about bisexuality and all these kinds of things. But the first time that she came, there was a woman who came to the presentation that we were having, and in addition to just like the large speech, like Robin just wanted to meet with like the campus group and meet with community members. She loves to just have these like conversations and things. And so we had this like, you know, people who were coming to the talk could come to this presentation. And there was a woman who came down from Canada, and she was there, and she was talking about her experience, and she was like, bisexuality is new to me and I don't really understand it exactly. But she's like, I've started calling myself bisexual because I have been a lesbian for 20 years. I've been a lesbian for 20 years. I've been with my partner for 20 years. And a year ago, my partner said to me, I am a man. I, you know, have gone through this soul searching. I've gone through this sort of process, and I've come to the understanding that I am a trans man. And so then she said, then I had some thinking to do, right? Like, I have been a lesbian for 20 years. My identity is that I am lesbian. I've never thought of being anything other than a lesbian. But now this person that I love and this person that I'm in a relationship is saying, you know, from her perspective, she's like, this might be who you have always felt that you were, but that's not who you presented. And that's not who I knew to be in a relationship with. And so, okay, transphobes, we're going to get rid of you. And so she said, I have always been a lesbian. I've always thought of myself as a lesbian, but now this person, so I have to decide, am I going to leave this person just because their identity and how they like they're putting their sort of internal identification externally? Do I leave them? Or is this still the person that I've loved for 20 years? And so she said, I didn't want to leave that relationship. I still love my partner. I still love my spouse. But now, our lives are fundamentally changing. And that's how, for her husband, it was like, these things are completely, and that was like she said that was one of the arguments that they would have as they were like working through this transition, is that he would say, gender identity and sexuality are completely different. And she would say, for you, because you're dealing with them separately. But she's like, my sexual identity is lesbian, but now I'm with a man. So like, how do you say that sexual, because I'm going to stay with you and I still love you, and we're going to work through what this means for not only our relationship, but for our sex lives. And so she's like, so yeah, they're different things, but like they're related. Like they are definitely part of this, and it has to be part of the discussion. And I just thought that was so interesting, because I feel like that's a perspective that doesn't get put out there very much. And that, of course, all of that brings us in to talk about Psycho. So Psycho, this sort of prototypical slasher. And so Hitchcock creates this world. This movie, I know that this is so dumb, and like, if I had a time machine, obviously I'd want to like do something good or whatever. But like, if I had a time machine where I couldn't go and like affect history, I could just be part of history. Because if you say something like that you're just interested in, people are like, why wouldn't you go kill Hitler or do this or whatever? So let's say I had a time machine, but I can't affect history. I can just go watch it. I would want to go to one of the original initial screenings of Psycho, because I think that now everybody just kind of knows about Psycho. They know the twist. They know the thing. And if you don't know, I'm about to tell you, because this movie is from 1960. So if you haven't had a chance to watch it in 66 years, you're behind and you need to catch up on that. But I'm from Grand Forks, North Dakota. Yes, hello, McDonald's. So I would go back and watch it, because I can't imagine how shocking and transformative that ending of Psycho was for movie-going audiences, because Hitchcock did something so interesting. And there's actually another movie that's very similar. It's a British movie called Peeping Tom, and it does a similar thing where it puts the audience in this sort of like POV of the killer and like makes you sort of weirdly complicit. But what's interesting about Psycho is that, so it sets up Marion Crane as our protagonist. So Marion Crane, played by Janet Leigh, of course. And the first 35 minutes are with her, and we're in her perspective, and she's having an affair with this guy named Sam, and then she goes to her work, and she's got this kind of flighty coworker who's kind of a ditz, who's played by Hitchcock's daughter. And Hitchcock has a cameo while she's at work. And her boss is a little bit of like, he's nice enough, but he's a little bit of a not great. And then he's got this client who's just like kind of a creep and showing off his money, and he's going to buy his daughter a house for her wedding, and he's bragging about how much money he has and kind of trying to flirt with Janet Leigh and all this kind of stuff. And so they ask her to deposit the money on her way home, and she takes it and she leaves because she's going to go, because this guy she's having an affair with has all this debt, and he can't marry her because he doesn't want to attach her to all this debt. And it's this whole thing. So she decides she's going to steal the money. She's going to give it to him so he can pay his debts. So she goes, and she's like paranoid, and the paranoia where she's being followed by a cop, and then she decides to go and like just buy a car. Excuse me, pretty girl, because she stole like $10,000, which at the time you could buy a fairly nice house. And you could just go and buy a car in cash. And so she just went and bought a used car and takes it. And it starts raining, and she has to stop along the road, and she stops at the Bates Motel. And she meets Norman, who is awkward. He's a little bit awkward. He's a little bit weird, but he's likable generally. Like, we feel sorry for Norman, because once he starts talking about Mother and his relationship to Mother, it's clear that he is like maybe a little bit of Arrested Development, and like he's browbeaten by this like verbally abusive mother, all this kind of stuff. And so, but we like Norman. Like, we like him. Even like when there's little creepy things, like there's all the taxidermy and like that's his hobby. Like there's little clues, but like Janet Lee, like Marion, she just kind of responds to him and they have this nice conversation. And she's like trying to encourage him to get out. And then, he seems very sweet and very nice and, all this kind of stuff. And so they're just kind of having this nice conversation. And then she goes back to her room and she decides she's going to go back and she's going to give the money back. And she's just going to have to, all the creepy stuffed birds. Absolutely. Yeah. So all the like taxidermy, and we all go a little mad sometimes. So there's definitely clues that things are a little bit off with Norman. And then when he's got the peephole into the window or into the room, because he puts her in cabin 1, which is right next to the office. And so, but Norman, we generally like him, but Janet Lee, Marion Crane, is our, usually in a movie, like the final girl, there's always somebody that we are meant to identify with. They're the main kind of protagonist character, and we spend little bits of time with other characters and stuff, but she's the one we're supposed to watch and to follow. 35 minutes in, she's dead, right? Mother has killed her. And so what's the audience supposed to do? Because Marion, we liked her. She was flawed. She did some bad things, but she was going to go atone for it. And then she gets murdered. And so of the other characters in the film, the only logical person that you can identify with is Norman. Because even though he's a little bit weird, he's maybe a little bit awkward, the other choices are Marion's. So there's Sam, who is the guy that she was having the affair with. And he's like just kind of this like shiftless layabout kind of guy. And he's a little bit too slick. Like there's something about him that's a little bit off-putting. And then Marion's sister Lila is like a shrew. Especially at that time, she would have been seen as just like this shrewish, shrill woman who's like looking for her sister, and she's always like busting in where she doesn't belong, and she's interrupting and she's rude. So she's not the like typical feminine woman. So like we don't really like her. And then there's this private investigator hired by her employer to try to find the money, Arbogast. And Arbogast is, hello squirrel, nice to see you, welcome. And so he's been hired to try to find her, and he's just an asshole to everybody. So there's nobody to identify with except Norman. And so it's really interesting. There's this scene where he's taken Marion's body and put it in the trunk of her car, and he goes to sink her car in this swamp. And what I think is so fascinating, and I don't remember where I think it was an article that when I was doing my research for my master's thesis, and I hadn't really noticed it until then, or I hadn't put the words to it, but when he goes to sink the car in the swamp, there's a point where it's sinking and it stops like halfway through. And Norman just like looks around and he's all freaked out. And we feel sorry for Norman. So Norman, at that point, we don't know that Mother and Norman are the same person. We think that his mother has killed her, and he's trying to like hide the crime and protect his mother and do all this kind of stuff. So the car sinks and we're all like, oh my God, what if he gets caught? And it's like, what? We should get caught. He should get caught. But we are in the perspective now of Norman. And so it's like, oh my God. And it's this tense moment. And then there's this sigh of relief as like the car continues to sink down. And so it's this moment where when it's revealed in the cellar that he is Mother, such a shock, because we've been identifying with him. We cared about Norman. We thought Norman was kind of a sweet, maybe tragic figure, and we were like, oh, Norman, he's done some bad things, but he's just doing it to protect his mother, and he doesn't know what else to do, and if only he could break away from her. And then you find out that he is Mother. And that, when the person that you identify with in the film all of a sudden is the villain, and to have it revealed in this like shocking, where it like comes in the dress and the wig, and then Sam struggles with him and the wig comes off and the dress rips open and we see that it's Norman. I mean, that, I wish I could have been in a theater when like one of the first audiences saw that, just to see the reactions and just to see how people process that, because it's such an interesting betrayal of like what we've been told to believe about these characters. It's so fascinating. And so what I was talking about earlier, where I was getting kind of like, I was going back and forth between gender identity and gender presentation, this is something where a lot of people have railed against Psycho as being transphobic. And there are some films that we're going to talk about that, because one of my favorites, Sleepaway Camp, we're going to talk a little bit about that later too. But there are films that get sort of branded as transphobic. And some of them, like the Sleepaway Camp sequels, there's blatant transphobia. We'll talk about that. But in some of these films, hello, bud, we are talking about queer horror history, queer horror cinema and literature. We're talking about Psycho right now. And so Psycho gets kind of branded as transphobic. And I think, you know, when we talk about these things, again, I was an English major. That's what my master's degree is in. Literary analysis, pop culture analysis. We love to pick things apart and make arguments. It doesn't mean that you have to like 100% go with my argument. It doesn't mean you have to believe everything that I say. But if you don't agree with me, then make an argument, like construct it, use the evidence, right? Like there's all that kind of stuff. And one of the arguments that I think has never held water about Psycho and about Sleepaway Camp in particular is people will say, oh, well, people wouldn't have known the difference because neither Norman Bates nor Angela from the first Sleepaway Camp are presented as trans characters. They're not like people who, you know, chose to transition. They felt like their identity, their internal identity was different than what they were assigned at birth, and they transitioned and then they became killers and all that kind of stuff. And so the argument that people make is that, oh, well, the audience wouldn't know the difference. Like the audience in 1960 and 1983, 84, when Sleepaway Camp came out, they wouldn't have known the difference. And it's like, well, but then we're talking about, is something objectively transphobia or is it like subjectively transphobia? Like, is it objectively like I can see clear evidence that shows that this is transphobic, or is it this is something that is subjectively, like from my perspective when I watch this, I feel like this feels transphobic to me and to my experience and so it gets into that weird kind of place because I don't think there's nothing in Psycho that is objectively transphobic, because Norman's transgression, even though it's something that is put out as sort of like pathology or whatever, right? There's this weird line and we're never really sure about, like, has Norman become like that voice of Mother in his head where she says, I wouldn't hurt a fly at the end. Is Norman the monster? Is he using this, like, did he create this for a pathology that he already had? And so the gender kind of, it becomes more about just this idea of the transgression, like as he transgresses the norms of gender to recreate Mother. And then it was sort of like put in later sequels that he killed Mother. That becomes a whole other thing. And then there's like sexual abuse and stuff, but that's not in the original. The original is just that Mother died and he like got her body back and created this persona, like trying to keep her alive. But there's no, so it's like, is Mother the killer, or is he like, because he's transgressing, he goes so far that Norman is the actual problem, is because he breaks from his like determined role, from his gender role, like that he becomes the monster? Or is it the like, because he's transformed, like Mother? So it leaves it up to this sort of ambiguity of what caused this, and is it Norman or is it Mother? Like it leaves this kind of interesting, it leaves sort of a strange, let me see, we're going to hide that person. Buffalo Bill. We'll talk a little bit about Silence of the Lambs. I have thoughts on Silence of the Lambs. Is it like Alter Ego? I don't know if I've seen Alter Ego. Tell me more about that. Oh, and then we're getting spammed. Okay, sorry. Let's go ahead and hide the user. Yep, you can go too. Yeah, so what were we talking? So we were talking, it's more about, it's not about a trans person at all. Certainly trans people existed. It wasn't as well known, but like some of the early cases of like trans people who were covered in the media, like Christine Jorgensen, were around by the time that Psycho came out. So there was a context for having created like a trans character. That's not what Hitchcock did. And so I think that, like, I'm not saying that anybody can't be offended about Psycho or feel like it feels transphobic to them, but is it objectively evidence-based transphobic? I don't think so. I think that just like any other argument about what a text means, if you want to try to create an argument that Psycho is transphobic, I think you're welcome to do that. But I think that sometimes people will just say, they'll just dismiss something, and just because they say that it's something, you have to believe that it's something. Norman Bates acting out his alter ego. Sorry, I thought that was a film. Yeah, so like Norman Bates acting out this kind of alter ego, and is it, maybe it has to do with cross-dressing. Like, we don't really know enough of the stuff. We don't really know enough to give us the truth or give us what this is. It's left ambiguous, and it's left ambiguous, I think, on purpose, and I think that that serves it. And that's something that we'll get back to again with Sleepaway Camp. So the beginning of slashers start with Psycho, and then what I find very interesting and what I'm thinking about doing a separate video on is that from Psycho, then this slasher subgenre starts to develop, and it takes a little while. I think Halloween does it the best in terms of setting up what people expectations are for slashers. Halloween is kind of the best one, but like in 1974, we have the first iteration of Black Christmas, and that one, the killer isn't really a fully fledged character. It's somebody that we think is called Billy because the sorority house where people are getting murdered keeps getting these phone calls talking about Billy and Agnes. Is the caller Billy? We don't know. Who is Agnes? How does this all... And there's like one shot where we see the killer and it's just this guy. And so but there's no, it's not... At that point, the thought was that slashers, for that film, it seems like their thought was that the violence, the like kills, is like what's going to define the slasher. And that becomes very important. But as we find out with Halloween, the killer is just as important as the victims and as the violence that's shown. And having like a defined killer with a backstory and with all these sorts of things. And so we get these interesting things like... Black Christmas. And what I think is also interesting, because we see it with Friday the 13th, the first one, is that there's also, in some of these slashers, especially in some of the lesser known slashers, there are actually a lot of female killers. And so there's a lot of times where the killer's female because it relies on this idea of, well, of course it's not a woman, right? Like, women wouldn't do that. Men are the source of violence, like, truth. They kind of are. That's where most wars and everything come from. But so they use that sort of gender trope of, well, it wouldn't be a woman. A woman wouldn't do this. A woman wouldn't murder people and all this kind of stuff. And so there's a movie, Funeral Home. There's Friday the 13th, where we have Mrs. Voorhees for the first one. I always forget the name of it, but there's a Christmas, it's another kind of sorority house where everybody's getting killed, but the house mother is the killer, and I forget what it's called, but if I do that video, I'll do more research. But so there's a lot of like female killers, and that comes up, and it's always kind of a surprise. So when Scream comes along and reinvigorates slasher films, Urban Legend came out during that time, and that's the first Urban Legend has a female killer. Scream incorporated female killers in several installments, and so this idea of... And I think once we get into Scream, we get into these later ones, it's still a little bit shocking, but it loses some of the shock value because we've lost some of that like gender programming of women don't do this, women don't do this. Now, one slasher that I do want to talk a little bit more about is Sleepaway Camp, because Sleepaway Camp is probably my favorite horror movie. I love it. I'm not saying it's the best horror movie, I just think it's my favorite. And I think it's because I've been wrestling with what it means for so long. I wrote an entire chapter of a master's thesis that was inspired by that movie, and I still am trying to figure it out. I went to a horror convention specifically to meet Felissa Rose, and I've asked her about it, and we've talked about it. Like, it's fascinating to me because especially when because again, Sleepaway Camp, the main character is not presented as being a trans character. Now, there are some other like trans elements, trans adjacent elements, as we talked to. Again, this movie is 40 some years old. I'm about to spoil it for you, but So with Sleepaway Camp, if you don't know the story, basically it opens where there's this guy on a little boat. They're at like a summer camp. They're near the summer camp, and there's cabins all around and all these kinds of things. And there is a guy and his two children. There's a boy and a girl, and they're playing in this boat. And then there's another guy that's on the shore, and he's like, "Come on, John, we got to get going. We got to meet Martha." Blah blah blah. And then, yeah, I know. And they're playing and splashing or whatever. And then the kids are kind of like, he's getting stuff ready in the boat, and the kids are kind of rambunctious and playful, and like the kids end up surprising their dad and like to push him in the water, and the whole boat tips, and all three of them are in the water. And then we see there's this speedboat where there are these kids. I don't know if they're supposed to be like campers or camp counselors or just other people who are along this lake, and they're in this speedboat and they're drinking and they're not really paying attention, and this girl wants to drive the boat, and the guy's like, okay, whatever, and he's not really paying attention, so he lets her drive the boat, and she's going too fast, and she ends up running right through them or whatever. And so then we see the like so after, and they're like, oh my god, you're gonna hit them, and he doesn't stop in time and goes right through them. And so then we see the dad floating face down in the water, and then we see a kid from behind splashing. And so, but we don't know which kid it is. That's important. Splashing. And then all of a sudden this like ripped up and bloody life preserver rises out of the water. So we're supposed to know that one of the kids died. So the next scene that we go to is Ricky and his cousin Angela and Aunt Martha. So Martha is Ricky's mother, and she's getting the two kids ready to go to Camp Arawak. And so they're going to go for summer vacation. And so then we figure out from this, because the two kids are Peter and Angela. And so we figure out, oh, Angela is the one who lived. And so now they're getting ready to go to camp. And Angela, played by Felissa Rose, wonderful, is very quiet and kind of withdrawn. And then Aunt Martha is very strange. Desiree Gould, rest in peace, did such a great job with this role because she's so creepy and so weird. And she talks about how she's got a string like tied around her finger so she won't forget. Yes, I can't forget. And like, and then tells them, here's your physical slip, because she's a doctor. She's apparently some kind of doctor, and she's like, here's your physical slips. Now remember, don't tell anyone that I did your physicals. Even though I am a doctor, that wouldn't be good at all. No, it certainly wouldn't be good at all. When you watch the movie, I love Aunt Martha. She's so weird and creepy. But so it's like put in there that she's done their physicals. And so like, she doesn't want anybody to know that, so don't tell anybody or whatever. So then we go off to camp. Ricky is a little bit of a hothead, so he's getting into fights all the time. And Angela is just kind of weird and withdrawn and very quiet. And so Ricky is often getting into fights because he's protecting Angela. And so he will go, like, if somebody picks on her, then he'll go and fight. And so they're trying to build this like red herring of like him being really kind of a hothead, and he's always getting into fights, like maybe he's the killer, right? So then people start dying, right? And people at the camp start dying who are picking on Angela, or in some way threatening her. And so the first one to go is this cook, who is a creepy pedophile. I mean, now, like, I can't imagine that they would even put a character like this. So maybe for shock value, but because they're like, him and the other cooks are standing around talking about all the hot little kids that are coming, and the other cooks are like, aren't they too young? And he's like, no such thing, like, and it's creepy. So he is the first one to go because he corners Angela in the like walk-in freezer. She goes to get like, I don't know if she got picked on, so she didn't eat at lunch or whatever, but then they go and she's going to get some food or to get something or whatever, and he corners her in the walk-in, and he's clearly there and he's going to molest her. And then it's only because Ricky shows up and like gets her out of there. Well, then all of a sudden the cook gets killed. And so it starts being that anytime somebody picks on Angela, they get killed off. But as you look, and then of course, so we think it's maybe Ricky, and then people are starting to suspect, and like the people at the camp who know what's going on, they all, like the owner comes to think that it's Ricky and all this kind of stuff. And eventually it's revealed to be Angela. And what we find out at the very end is not only is it Angela, but that Angela isn't Angela at all. Angela is Peter. And so in these so before we get this big reveal, and that's one that people have seen kind of the image from, is hello, real Indiana. You seem like a fun one. Before we get the big reveal where Angela is like naked, covered in blood, because she's killed this other little camper, and she's like beheaded him, and she's sitting on the beach with his head in her lap and like stroking his hair, because we think that she maybe liked him or whatever, and we're gonna get to that. There's these two like flashbacks, and the first one is that we find out that their father and the guy that was on the beach were a gay couple. And so we get this flashback of the two kids standing in the doorway and looking in and seeing the two men in bed cuddling. I mean, that's as in 1984, that's as explicit as you could get, as they're just like holding each other and like stroking somebody's hair or whatever. And they're like looking in, and then it goes to this like shot that's going around. It's this like, it's filmed with this like rotation. And it's Angela sitting in her nightgown and Peter in his pajamas, and he's reaching out like this. He's reaching out like that, and he's getting closer and closer. And when his finger like is about to touch Angela, that's when we snap back. And there's another flashback where we see Aunt Martha, and she's talking to someone with their head bandaged because of the boat accident or whatever, and it's like, oh, I got you a pretty new dress and all this kind of stuff, and Ricky's going to be so excited that he's going to live with his cousin Angela and all this kind of stuff. And then she starts talking about how we already had a little boy. That wouldn't do it all. No, that wouldn't do it at all. And so we needed much better to have a little girl. Isn't that right, Peter? And then his head goes up, and then we get the reveal that Angela is actually Peter. And so, and what I love about it, and what I love about the ending, is that it does not give any sort of any resolution, any wrap up, because these two counselors find Angela on the beach, and then Angela stands up covered in blood. There's a full peen shot. Like, they apparently got some skinny little like twink like college freshman to come wear an Angela mask, and that's how they did the shot or whatever. But like, boy body, all this kind of stuff, and the two counselors are like, she's a boy. So I see how some people like might take that and think, oh, it's trying to make this like transphobic statement of like, she transitioned but she'll always be, and that's not what it is at all, because Angela, there's no sense that Peter was ever going to transition. Like, there's no sense that there's any sort of like sense of that at all. It's just that Aunt Martha is the one who dressed Peter up as Angela and forced them to take on this Angela persona. And so that's really the kind of source of it. And that's something that there is an old podcast episode here. It's one of my Janess After Darks where I interviewed Felissa Rose. And I asked her, I was like, do you think that Aunt Martha is the villain of Sleepaway Camp? And I was like, clearly, I mean, obviously Angela did what she did, all right, whatever, you know? And it's so hard because it's played by Felissa Rose, and because the role, Angela is so sympathetic, and we never really understand her as anything other than Angela. Like, once we learn, like, you would think it should go back to then calling them Peter and using he, him pronouns or whatever, but it's not that simple. It's really, really not... Oh, okay, you gotta go. There are all kinds of months that happen all the time, and you're a cunt, so you can go. I have little patience today. Today was not the day for patience, so people are just gonna get yeeted. But, and so there's no sense that this was actually somebody who was going to transition or whatever. But what I find very interesting is that the more you watch it and the more you look at the sort of context underneath it, it's not just that the people who were murdered were people who picked on Angela. The way that they engaged with Angela before that they were murdered, they did it in such a way that they were like forcing Angela to confront the sort of secret of her body and what's happened to her, and how Aunt Martha has forced her to take on this new persona. Because the cook was going to molest her. And then the next kid who gets murdered, he's like, there's this social or whatever. And they come, and he's trying to be fake flirty, and then, oh, why are you so uptight? Why are you such a prude? Like, flat as a board, all this kind of stuff. And so then he gets killed. So anybody who's like engaging with Angela and reminding her of her body and her physical presence, they are the ones who get murdered. And so at one point, you know, they're walking through camp and there's this guy, which can I just say that one of my favorite cinematic insults ever is this guy named Bill, who, first of all, trying to be like classic masculinity, there's some hoochie daddy shorts in this. Like the 80s were wild. And so he's always in these little denim cut off hoochie daddy shorts and a crop top. And you're going to be policing other people's gender and sexuality, sir? Take a seat. But my favorite cinematic insult is they're playing baseball or softball. And he's getting into a fight with Ricky. And he goes, "Eat shit and die, Ricky." And Ricky goes, "Eat shit and live, Bill." And that sends me. It sends me. It's the best cinematic insult that I've ever seen. I just love it. It's so dirty and just like, it's so perfectly timed. I love it. Jonathan Tiersten, who recently passed away, R.I.P., just fantastic. The delivery is fantastic. The writing is fantastic. Perfection. But so Bill, they're walking through camp and Bill throws they're throwing water balloons from the top of this cabin, and he hits Angela in the shirt, of course, which would, you know, cause the material to be see-through and would show that she doesn't have any breast growth and all this kind of thing. There's another time where two of the kind of mean girls throw Angela in the water. So she never goes in and goes swimming. And so they're always like mean to her, and they decide to like throw her in the water. So again, she's wet, she's exposed. And then as she's getting out of the water, then the littler kids from the camp start kicking sand on her and all this stuff while she's wet and exposed. And so those little kids get murdered. That's one of the things where it really plays with interesting sort of transgressions, because in typical slasher films, little kids are safe. You know, adults are mostly not present, but they're easily picked off if need be. It's usually about those like adolescent young adults, and they are the ones, because they're in the throes of puberty and hormones and all that stuff, they are the targets. Usually little kids are left alone. And in fact, in Friday the 13th part 6, there's a scene where Jason is like hunting people down and attacking people, and they've got all the kids locked into one cabin, and he comes in and he like looks at them, and then he just like walks out. Like he hears some other person or whatever, but he doesn't touch the kids because the kids are innocent. They're not part of this whole thing. And so he leaves them alone. But in this one, the kids that like threw the sand on Angela all get murdered, like hatchet. They don't show it. It's just kind of suggested. Like they still don't go that far in terms of like being graphic or whatever, but usually kids are left alone. In this one, they're not. And so there's all this kind of, so all of the people who got killed because they did something that forced Angela to sort of engage with the truth of her body. And so that's why then at the end we have this full reveal, and there's no explanation, there's no aftermath, there's no here's what happened. She's like giving this like horrible scream, and the screen just like fades. Crazy. I absolutely love it. It's so good. And so, yeah, so that's kind of what happens with Sleepaway Camp. And again, this is one where it's not objectively transphobic. I think that there are ways that you could make an argument to say that it's subjectively transphobic. I think there are things, but it's not about her being trans at all. It's not about, and what I think is, what I've kind of come to terms with, like I said, I'm still struggling with this movie. I'm still trying to figure it out. And maybe I never will. But where I have kind of landed is that, number one, Martha is the villain, because she's the one who like forces Peter to take on this new persona. But I think that when we think about the 1980s, because this was, like I said, 1983, 84, when we think about the 1980s, there was this weird conflation with homosexuality and, you know, gender bending stuff was often just thought of as like some sort of variation of homosexuality. And so the fact that we have this gay couple that are raising, and what's interesting to me about the gay couple is that the two scenes that they appear in, the one at the very beginning and the one where they're in bed, except for the fact that it's happening in the context of a horror movie, the scenes don't in any way show that couple as being, they're not shown abusing the children, they're not shown mistreating the children in any way. Both of the scenes are very just like loving family moments. And I think that what kind of happens here to me is that in the 80s, a lot of the arguments around whether gays should be able to adopt or raise children or foster children or any of that kind of stuff, there was this idiotic idea that somehow, like, two men or two women raising a child would turn a child gay, right? So I think that, we've got these two men who are raising these children. And so Aunt Martha, when she takes in the surviving child, she's like, well, I can't have two boys because this boy was already raised by two men. If I have two boys, then they will both become gay or whatever. So I need to, like, reaffirm the gender balance. I need to reaffirm the gender roles. And I need to have Peter needs to become Angela, which is twisted and bizarre. And it's not what being trans is about. Like, somebody else telling you that you have to be Angela instead of Peter is not a trans narrative in any way. But I think that what's suggested is that I think that Peter is kind of coded as that maybe if he had just been left alone, he still would have gone off to summer camp with Ricky. And I think that he would have been gay because the crux of this whole thing and the big reveal is that there's this other camper named Paul. And Paul is interested in Angela. Paul is attracted to Angela. And that's something that shows up in a lot of these kind of cross-gender movies. If you think about, like, Tootsie and Some Like It Hot, there's usually some, like, clueless dude who's into the cross-dressed woman character. With these teenagers and all this stuff, like, Paul really seems to like Angela. He seems to care for Angela. And she seems to be responding to him. And so I think it's one of these things that, like, if Peter had just been allowed to be Peter and go off, I think that he would have realized that he was gay. And, like, there's the support of, like, well, he was raised by two gay parents or whatever. And so that he would have been raised as gay, or he would have come out as gay because he responds to Paul, but then he, like, pulls back because, I'm going to go to they, them, because it's just easier. Like with Angela, like I said, it's not a perfect narrative and it's hard to kind of figure out how to talk about it. But, like, I think that, like, they are attracted to Paul, but then they pull back because they know that there's this secret, right? There's this secret of, like, what their body, the truth of their body versus what they're presenting to the world, which is where you could start to build an argument for potentially some transphobia. But I think that it does it in a way that is not negative to Peter / Angela. It's something that is very, I think, negative to Aunt Martha. And so then at the end, because he's been trying to, like, maybe try to steal a kiss or try to, like, hold her hand or something, and she's always, like, pulled away. And finally she's just like, meet me at the waterfront after the social. And that's when he goes down, and then Angela kills him, and it's his head that's in her lap. Because she's naked, she's revealed the truth. They have revealed, again, it's so, trying to figure this out and trying to figure out the terms is so difficult, but they've, like, revealed the truth of their body, and then their only option, the way they saw it, was then to kill him because you have to keep the secret. But then it's, like, not even, because this connection isn't possible because it's not there. And we see the way that Angela, like, cradles Paul's head and is stroking it really is reminiscent of the scene we saw with the two fathers earlier in the film. And then to stand up and just, like, it's like this primal rage of not being able to have this thing that you want, knowing that society doesn't think it's appropriate. And now, because of this deception that you've been forced into, it's something that, if they had just been Peter, they could have potentially, like, come out to them, and maybe Paul would have freaked out, and maybe Paul would have been okay with it, but, like, I'm not attracted to you. Maybe it would, like, who knows what it would have been, but, like, just this rage of, like, I didn't even get that. Like, I didn't even get to approach this in a real way. That's kind of where I've landed with it now. I probably need to spend more time with it and keep thinking about it. Now, the sequels to Sleepaway Camp, there is some blatant, like, objective transphobia in there, because what they do, and I kind of almost understand it, not that it's okay, but I understand how it went that way, because you've created this first movie, and now if you're going to create sequels, it's like, well, this whole movie revolved around this secret and then the revelation of the secret. Well, the revelation of the secret is there, so what do we do? What do we do? So do we have Angela go back to Peter, and then Peter is trying to readjust. What do we do? And so what they did, and this is where the transphobia comes in, is that they do this whole thing about how Angela was sent off to like an asylum, like a mental institution, and she was given a sex change operation. You know, that was the terminology at the time. And so they're like, and this kid who's talking about it, whose dad was like one of the cops, apparently, like that becomes the story, is he's like, and they gave her a sex change, and our tax dollars paid for it, and all this kind of stuff. So it's all this like weird. It becomes very transphobic, and that kid. When he encounters then Angela later, is like, I should have called you Peter, and like, so there's a lot of like misgendering and dead naming and all this kind of stuff that like is blatantly transphobic. So the sequels, absolutely, there's some transphobia that cannot be denied, but I think with the original it's much more nuanced. And again, if you have to resort to this argument of, you know, that audiences wouldn't know the difference, they wouldn't understand that this isn't trans character, well, then you're assuming things about the intelligence and the knowledge and the experience of your audience that is not inherent to the film itself. You could use that to make an argument about how you could read this as transphobic, but I don't think it's objectively. I never thought of it from that perspective. So interesting. I have to watch that movie. It's been a long. Yeah, I'm fascinated by it. That I watched it as a teen, and it fucked with my brain trying to figure it out. And I've been thinking about it ever since, like for years and years and years. And so for just like a low budget B horror movie to do that, I'm like, that's my favorite. Hello, Tanya. How's it going? It's my favorite. It's my favorite. I love it. I'm just like, I have to keep wrestling with it and trying to figure out what it's saying. And so, but there's something about that. And if you read Carol Clover, she has this fantastic book. She's the one who's kind of credited with with creating the term final girl, Carol Clover. She has a book called Men, Women, and Chainsaws, which is essays about modern gender in the modern horror film. And one of the things she talks about is with slashers and with this final girl aesthetic is that the whole slasher subgenre in many ways is built on this sort of incomplete, ineffective gender presentation. That what ends up happening in so many of these movies is that you have the killer who is a male character who is somehow feminized. So there's something where it comes out of him being like picked on or not being the alpha male, you know, being, and there's something about him that's why there's always like not, you know, there's not, except in very few instances, Terrifier fans, get out of my comment section, but like in most slasher films, there's never guns. Like the killer never has a gun. It's always, or if they do, it's used. There's one death in one of the Halloween sequels, like 4 or 5, where I think somebody's got a gun and Michael Myers corners them and like turns the gun around and uses it on. I think there is, if I remember right. I think it's the cop's daughter or whatever. But even that, it's very intimate, because with slasher films, what's important is the sort of stabbing, right? It's the penetration, because the killer is thought to be sort of an incomplete man, an ineffective man. He's not able to be a true performing heterosexual man. And so the killings become this sort of intimate act of penetration. And then the final girls are, you know, there's always this talk about, you know, horror films as having this sort of conservative morality, because if you have sex, you die. If you drink, you die. If you smoke weed, you die. If you transgress, if you're a bully, you get killed, all this kind of stuff. So there's all this stuff, if you like in some way disrupt the like good Christian order of things, then you get killed or whatever. And people will make the argument that is evidence that these have this sort of conservative morality. I, as a queer theorist, as somebody who looks at that, I'm like, that theory only holds water if you think that the killer is justified. Because if you think that the killer is justified, then yes, if you drink, the killer is going to come and kill you. If you have sex, if you smoke weed, if you do whatever, the killer is going to come and kill you. But in these films, it's clearly presented as a problem. These killings are not seen as justified. They're not seen as for the good of the community. So, excuse me, pretty girl. So to try to argue that these films are embracing and sort of like saying that this conservative morality is correct. It's like, no, this killer comes in and is a threat to the community and has to be stopped, and is stopped by the final girl, who is sort of the opposite. So if the killer is sort of a feminized man most of the time, the final girl is sort of a masculine woman. Because if you think about, you know, if you have sex, you get killed. So all of the like blonde, bouncy, booby kind of girls, they're all getting killed, right? Like the big booby girls that are running around in lingerie, they don't live till the end. So it's always the girl who's a little bit mousy. She's always like too prim and proper to turn down, to like take the weed. She always turns it down. You know, she's usually a virgin and frustrated, and she usually has a boyfriend, and the boyfriend's frustrated because she's not giving it up and all this. And so she's got like, a lot of times she'll have slightly more, so like, you know, like Tiffany gets killed, Nancy lives. So if it's a less like, I don't want to say less feminine. It's not that Nancy, Nanners, if you watch this, I'm not saying that Nancy is not a feminine name, but like Nancy, Lori, Chris, there's lots of these names that are a little bit more gender, you know, could be either, like Chris could be male, could be female, could be whatever this is. Lori, you know, some of those names. So she's often masculinized. She's a little bit mousier. She's a good student. She's a good girl. And so she's kind of a little bit not this sort of ultra feminine, sexy sort of thing that women are kind of supposed to be. They're supposed to get in trouble for it, but they're supposed to be that. And so Carol Clover kind of talks about how you get this interesting juxtaposition of this feminized man has to be bested by this masculine woman, and that's this sort of conflict that happens in these slasher films, and that's why there's this final girl. I'm planning to do a video about final boys, because there are a few slasher films that actually kind of break the whole thing, and it's really interesting when they do that, because there's more of a final boy. The big three franchises, Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street, all have an episode, at least one episode, where instead of a final girl, it's more of a final boy, and it leads to some interesting sort of things that happen when we do that. And so because it breaks that sort of trope, that convention of you need these two sort of not properly gendered people to kind of solve this conflict, right? This threat has to be taken care of. And because it's sort of queer, it's sort of other, you need somebody who is also sort of queer and sort of other. They need to set things back right. So when you put them together, it almost becomes this like, this amalgamation where all of the parts are together, right? Like a male and a female and a masculine and feminine. When we talked about bodies that matter, like which bodies matter and which bodies don't, you almost need like these two to come together so that it restores the balance in the community, because with those two others kind of separated, it's out there. Now, somebody earlier mentioned Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill, I think, is very interesting, because that one, I think there is more of an argument to be made for transphobia in that film, but also as somebody who is interested in queer theory and is always kind of reading against the grain, and I'm not looking for just like the obvious explanation. I'm looking for like where, you know, when we talked about Queer Theory 101, Foucault, not where people say the power is, but where does the power actually lie? Because the story of Buffalo Bill is that they said that, and they always use he throughout, that he, you know, went to a therapist and was, you know, saying that he was trans and he wanted to transition. And this was at a time where there were so many more barriers for trans people in terms of how you had to access care and the things that you had to prove in order to be able to pursue any sort of transition and all this kind of stuff. And so they felt that Buffalo Bill didn't meet the criteria. And so then we get into Silence of the Lambs, where he's kidnapping women, killing them, and taking their skin to create like a skin suit to create the body that he felt that he should have. Well, yes, there's definitely some argument for some transphobia in that narrative, but also, if you're really looking at it, if Buffalo Bill had been listened to, and if Buffalo Bill had been treated with the respect that they should have had as a patient in the medical system, if they had been allowed to like be able to define their identity, if they could have gone to a doctor and said, I am transgender, and they would have said, okay, let's get you started on this transition process, the whole trajectory of Silence of the Lambs wouldn't happen. So, like, obviously being denied trans healthcare doesn't mean you can become a serial killer. So it's not endorsing it. But in a way, Buffalo Bill is, the transphobia comes from the medical system of saying that, like, somebody tells you this is who I am, and the medical system says, no, you're not. That to me is where the real transphobia is in Silence of the Lambs, is that Buffalo Bill is saying this is who I am, and they're like, no, you're not. And then, of course, the reaction is extreme. The reaction is disruptive. The reaction is inexcusable. But it's a reaction to how they were treated in the medical system, that they were not listened to, that their identity was not validated. They were told that somebody else knew their identity better than they did. Does that sound familiar? Look at all of the arguments that are happening in culture right now about gender affirming care. And what people even like think counts as gender affirming care, right? Because you limp dick Republican motherfuckers with your Viagra, that is gender affirming care. Maybe God just wanted you to have a soggy dick that doesn't work. But you're getting gender affirming care so that you can express yourself sexually in a way that fits your internalized idea of yourself. It's gender affirming care. People who get boob jobs, people who get rhinoplasties, like there's so many different things that are gender affirming care. Do you think Buffalo Bill could have been referencing Ed Gein? I think there are parts of it. The Ed Gein story is so tame compared to all the things that then have been inspired from Ed Gein. Like Texas Chainsaw Massacre is inspired by Ed Gein. I think they did say that there were some things with Silence of the Lambs that were inspired, the original book, that were, and then obviously into the movie, but were inspired by Ed Gein. And so, to me, like, the whole root of the problem was the medical system that tried to tell. And so now now it's not even the medical system. Now we have Republican legislators that are trying to tell parents what medical treatment their children are allowed to have without consulting the parents, without consulting the child. And they're trying to ban it for adults. So then so they try to present it as this sort of like protecting minors, but then they go after it for adults. And so it's like, what are you doing? What's the end game? And it's just about control and about power and about policing gender roles. And if Buffalo Bill had been left alone and had been allowed to transition as they had wanted, the events of Silence of the Lambs would never have taken place. So as much as there's hints of transphobia in that narrative, the true transphobia goes back to how Buffalo Bill was treated by the medical establishment. So that's an argument that I will get into forever. I don't think the movie is perfect, but I think that it gets slighted for things that it doesn't really deserve. Because I think that if you go into it and if you look at sort of the cause of things, the real villain is Aunt Martha and the real villain is the medical establishment. In both of these films that are sort of maligned, the whole narrative that people have a problem with, that narrative would never have happened if people's gender identities and sexual identities and their like just personal perspectives and understanding of themselves and their own experience had been respected. Neither of those narratives would have happened. So I think that Aunt Martha and the medical establishment in Silence of the Lambs need to be seen as the true villains of those movies. It doesn't excuse what they did, but they wouldn't have done what they did. That's what we're saying. So there's lots of queerness in horror, this idea of the other. And now I love that, like, we're getting more, like, out characters. And I love that we're starting to see good queer characters. So, like, among the people in horror films, it's not just the killer. We're also getting queerness and open, avowed queerness among the other people. And there's so many creators. So we talked about from the very beginning, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, Bram Stoker, very, very queer. But now, like Kevin Williamson, who wrote Scream, Christopher Landis, who did Freaky and has done a bunch of other stuff. I can't remember. Is Mike Flanagan queer? I cannot remember. I feel like he is, but I don't want to say that for sure. But there's so many like creators. There's so many actors. I mean, Anthony Perkins, who starred in Psycho, was a gay man. And Oz Perkins has started to talk about his father and like some of that history in very fascinating ways. And like his father's relationship to his mother, and also the fact that he was still gay and all this kind of stuff. Very fascinating. So like queer people are just drawn to horror because in some ways it tells our stories, and it tells stories that we can relate to, because not only are we often, you know, the sort of heteronormative people will paint us as the monster, but then also for me, like, and I don't know if, I think for other queer people maybe would say this as well, is that like I can see myself somewhat in the monster and in their more like in the story of otherness, but I also see me in the like survivors and the people fighting. That monster almost becomes a representative of heteronormativity and like how it's trying to destroy me every day, like these trolls that come in here and like want to talk about how this is, oh, isn't it, don't you do you think it's a coincidence that Pride Month is right after Mental Health Month? Like, eat a dick, get the fuck out of here. But that kind of like that kind of shit, those sort of like the people who try to police your gender, they try to police your sexuality, and they think they just have a right to do that, that like it makes it easy for me to like absolutely like connect with those characters who are being chased and hunted by these marauding monsters in these situations. And so I just think that queerness is so interesting. There's so much good queer stuff out there. I absolutely recommend, if you have Shudder, that Queer for Fear. It's a 4-part little mini docuseries. It's got really fun people in it. Justin Simeon, who's been a judge on Dragula a few times, and I believe is a filmmaker or maybe a screenwriter. Alaska Thunderfuck is in there from Drag Race. There's a lot of great writers. The director, Kimberly, is it Pierce, who directed, oh God, that movie went right out of my head. The Brandon Tina story, the one Boys Don't Cry with Hilary Swank. She's in there. There's so many wonderful people, so many good perspectives and things, and there's 4 different episodes. They are so good. I absolutely love them. So definitely, if you have Shudder, check out Queer for Fear. That's a good one. There are some that talk more generally about queer cinema, and we're going to get into some of the like other queer cinema that's not horror later, but like The Celluloid Closet is an older one. And people have been putting out that quote a lot lately, because every year we get it. There's always like homophobes that think they're Duncan when they say like, why isn't there straight Pride Month? Why isn't it? Yeah, because you're the first person who ever said that, Cletus. Jesus Christ. And so they'll always be like, why? And a lot of people will put out this quote from Vito Russo of like, I didn't get to see myself growing up. And I'm going to butcher it. Like, I don't know the quote exactly, but basically talks about the fact that I didn't get to see myself growing up. All I was shown was heterosexual couples, situations, relationships, all this kind of stuff. So when I started looking for myself, like, it does become important. It does become like, we need to emphasize this, because everybody deserves to see themselves represented in some way. And so, you know, everything when it's, you know, I saw a TikTok recently where somebody was like, the people who are like, you know, where's straight Pride Month? And he likened it, he's like, you are a child. You are a literal child, because it's kind of like when children, when it's Mother's Day or Father's Day, and kids will be like, when is Kids Day? And it's like, every other fucking day is Kids Day. Like, get over it. And so and he's like, that's what you sound like. You sound like a fucking literal child. And so I love that, because that's absolutely true. And that Vito Russo quote, he wrote The Celluloid Closet and the documentary. If you want a history of like trans characters in film, I think it dives into television a little bit too. Disclosure is a really good one. That I believe is on Netflix. So The Celluloid Closet. There was another one that Lily Tomlin was in that I think had lavender in the title, but I can't remember what that one is. It's been a while since I've seen that one. But there's lots of great documentaries. When we get into the one in 2 weeks where we talk about other cinema, we're going to talk a lot about Divine. There's a fantastic documentary called I Am Divine. There's another documentary that's a little bit more indie, that's a little bit harder to track down, but it sometimes pops up on streaming services, and I think it's called Divine Trash. And I love that because there's this old interview clip where John Waters basically said that, like, I always saw Divine as the Godzilla of drag. And that because Divine was not popular among other cross-dressers at the time, because other cross-dressers were trying to be pageant queens and look like their, John Waters always says, wants to look like, they want to look like their mothers. And but they wanted to be pageant queens, and they wanted to be elegant, and they wanted to, you know, have this sort of like glamorous sort of thing. And Divine was like, I want to do trashy stuff. And they did all those fantastic movies. And people hated Divine because they thought that he was just too far, too much, whatever. And I'm like, I'm here for it. I'm so here for it. So that's kind of what we had to talk about for today. I enjoyed this. So yeah, and I think that this went better, like with the chat and everything. We didn't have as much chatting, I think, because Dion and I accidentally doubled up on our lives. So I think we kind of split our audience. We have very much... yeah, Divine didn't fit the mold, absolutely. So Dion and I have a lot of crossover in our audience, so I think we're going to be keeping our replay crew people busy. So yeah, I hope that people will circle back and watch this and leave your comments. So replay crew, you rock, and you especially rock for this one, so make sure you leave your comments down below so that you can get in on the discussion. But I think I hit all of the main comments that were about horror. There was somebody who brought up, I don't know if they're still here, but... brought up Boondock Saints. I haven't seen Boondock. Is that... because that's one of those like football things, isn't it? Like, is it a movie? Is it a series? But I think it's about football. So I never got into that. Oh, and then there's Deshawn. Yeah, I never responded to that because it's junk. But yeah, I think somebody brought up Boondock Saints. That's not one that I'm familiar with, but you know, there are lots of characters, and I think that like the representation of trans characters is very interesting, because I think that, and I think we're in a space where it's continuing. Can you hear me? What happened there? We're in a space where this is continuing to develop, because I don't, and of course, you know, this isn't necessarily my journey, so I have a different sort of perspective from it in terms of how trans characters are presented, because there are some people who will say that trans people should never be presented by somebody who's not a trans actor. And then people say, well, but if that's not possible or whatever, they should only ever be portrayed by someone who is of the gender that they transition to rather than away from. And I do absolutely understand that argument, because I think that there is an argument to be made about the idea that when you have like a man, a cisgender man actor playing a trans woman, it does for some people, again, we're getting into the audience though, like that's where I have a little bit of like, I'm not sure, but like, it does sort of, it can, I'm not gonna say it does, I'm not gonna say absolutely, but it can reinforce this idea that a trans woman is just a man in a dress. Like that's one of the most common transphobic tropes, is a trans woman is just a man in a dress, a trans man is just a woman dressed up, whatever. Excuse me, pretty girl. So I definitely understand that argument, and I think that, you know, it can be, it's a tricky place, because now we've got more trans actors, and obviously there are many trans actors who are not getting jobs. There's not enough roles, so representation I think is really important. But I think also, like, number one, being open to the idea of you can hire a trans actor even if it's not like the trans story, right? Like you can just have trans people existing in the worlds that you create. And you can have trans actors where it's explicitly stated that their character is trans, or you can have a trans actor that just exists, and some people might clock it, some people might not, but just like they exist in this world or whatever. But then something that I thought was really interesting that I'm still kind of grappling with is that, so Hunter Schafer, who was in the Hunger Games Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, she played Tigress. She has said in interviews, she's like, I don't want to play trans characters, which I thought was really interesting, because she's like, that just reduces me to my transness, and I want to do other kinds of things. And so it's like, well, then what happens? I mean, obviously that's not a widespread thing. I think there are a lot of trans actors that are like, I would love to play trans characters. I would love to play trans stories. But like that sentiment going out there, it does like, what if that, attitudes shift and things change? What if like that becomes a predominant sentiment? It's like, well, then do we just stop telling trans stories? That's not the answer. That's not okay. That's not good for representation. So like, I don't have any answers. I just have questions. Like that's one of those things that we're still in the middle of and I'm still grappling with. And I recognize that my placement is in a very different like space to that argument versus other people. Mama Champagne enjoyed this. Yes, you're very welcome. But yeah, so yeah, if there's any other questions or things that people had as we were going through, you can let me know. We can spend a little bit of time chatting. We are at 1:35, and so pretty soon YouTube is going to be on its bullshit again. It's going to start buffering and doing that thing. But we've got probably 10-15 minutes before it really starts doing that. So if anybody does have like questions or thoughts or anything that they want to bring up, absolutely, we can talk about that now. Or if you just want to chat and say hi, because I was kind of ignoring the chat earlier, you can do that. And yeah. But yeah, this was a good conversation. So next week, next Wednesday, we are going to get spicy. Next week is the hot take one. I'm excited for this. And next week is where we talk about the idea of, there's kind of two parts that are related, but we talk about the people who say no kink at Pride and what that means and why it's bullshit. I'll come out with my perspective right away. In case you were wondering, my hot take is that the no kink at Pride people can get fucked. I don't care. Take several seats. I have no interest. I'm not here to listen. That I've heard whatever arguments they've tried to make in their bullshit. So I don't, the no kink at Pride people, like, get out of here. But also one that's a little bit more subtle and that I think people on TikTok especially bristle at this whenever I bring it up. And I do bring it up because I do like to be causing trouble on the TikToks. But follow me at Janessa J. But family friendly, using that term is actually deeply, deeply anti-queer. And that's what we're going to talk about, is that you should not, if you are organizing Pride events, if you are organizing any sort of like diverse events and you want to be welcoming and open, you should not use the term family friendly. Hello, Dawn. How's it going? You should not use it. You just shouldn't. It's bad. It's anti-queer. It feeds into so much like Christian anti-gay propaganda. Like it's gross. And I know sometimes I hear, well, we'll get into that. Well, I was going to start to like dive into that. We'll talk about it next week. So that's a chance for you to come back, mark your calendars to come back next Wednesday, because we're going to talk about how the no kink at Pride people are bullshit. And we're going to talk about how family friendly is an anti-queer dog whistle and you should not use it. It is bullshit. Get rid of it. There are much better ways to describe, and there are ways that are more useful. There are ways that give better information to your potential audiences. It's going to make your events better, and it's going to make the language around your events more inclusive. Family friendly is a bullshit term to use, especially for queer events. Don't do it. Don't. So that's what we're talking about next Wednesday. And that is the 17th. Yes, today's the 10th. And then the next one after that is going to be the 24th, right? 17 plus 7, 24th. Simple math in my head. So that one is going to be about queer cinema more generally. So we're going to talk about Tu Wong Fu and Priscilla. We're going to do kind of a comparison and talk about how those movies in some ways are like, at a bare bones, are almost the same movie, but then they're so different in the actual execution. So we're going to talk about Tu Wong Fu versus Priscilla. We're also going to talk about Divine, and we're going to talk about other good matching there. We're going to talk about other interesting queer cinema, and so we're going to talk about things with Divine. We're going to talk about some of the old classic gay movies. I remember when I was in college, when I was in undergrad, I remember, because I started a collection of like gay movies, like as I started doing research and learning about gay culture and gay cinema, like for things that were explicitly gay, not just like the celluloid closet talks about a lot of movies where there's a lot of like sissy characters, there's a lot of things, but things that are like explicitly gay storylines, I was like, I'm going to collect all of them. Like, I'm going to start adding to my library. And there was a time when you could. Like, there was so little gay representation that if you were talking about like actual, like, I'm not talking, and some of it was like little indie movies and stuff, but like, even with the little indie movies and stuff, getting like explicitly queer narratives, you could kind of almost collect them all, like Pokemon. Like, and now, of course, they've proliferated and there's so much more representation that it would be almost impossible to collect every like gay narrative. Something where a gay character has the primary narrative or even like a predominant narrative throughout the film. So we're going to talk about some of the classics. We'll talk about Beautiful Thing. I love that movie. Oh, still touches my heart. I love it. Such a good one. We're going to talk about some other ones. So that's the thing for the next 2 weeks. Then there's also makeup. Remember how this is a big old drag queen makeup channel? There's going to be a couple of lives that I'm very excited for. And they are actually going to be on Monday the 22nd and Monday the 29th. And they are dual lives with my friend Dion. So on the 22nd, right? Because Wednesday's is 24th. So on Monday the 22nd, Dion and I are going to be going live on her channel, and we're going to be doing Pride looks. So she's going to be working with the MAC Colors of Pride. Where did I set it? I'm going to be working with the new Blend Bunny. It's huge. How can I not see it? Is it? Oh, I set a wig on top of it. That's why. I've got a loose feral wig over here that I just set of. Hello, Tony. What is that? Well, I'm a drag queen. I'm a model. I'm an actress. I'm a cultural commentator. I'm a makeup artist. Take your pick. There's so much. But I'm going to be using the new Blends palette. And so on the 22nd, I haven't planned out the look, but we are going to do planned looks on Dion's channel. And she's going to be using the MAC Colors of Pride. I think she might use a different palette. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'm definitely going to use this for both looks. But she's planning a Pride look. I'm planning a Pride look, and we're going to do that. On the 29th, we are doing Pride looks again on my channel, but we're doing a little bit differently because Blends has 40 shades. The Colors of Pride palette from MAC has 40 shades. We are doing Pride look bingo. And so we are going to number our shades. So obviously, like mine will probably be 1 through 10, 11 through 20, etc. And she's going to figure out how to number hers. And then we are going to do Pride palette bingo. Very, very excited. And so very excited for this to happen. And yeah, so we're going to do that. We're going to pick 6 colors. So I'm going to have a random number generator, and because the original Pride flag had 8, but like the 6 color, because there's so many different that we could choose or whatever. But the one that was around probably the longest is the 6 color Pride flag. Everybody recognizes it. So because there were 6 colors, there were 6 stripes. I'm going to use a randomizer to pick 6 numbers, and that's going to give us 6 shades out of our palettes, and we are going to create looks, and then we may zhuzh them up with crystals or glitter or other little things to kind of like add a little bit of extra sparkle and fun. But we for sure are going to do Pride palette bingo on the 29th. So lots more Pride content. I'm very excited for all of this kind of stuff. Oh, buffering has started for you? I haven't seen anything on my end. Oh no. Well, I was kind of wrapping up anyway, so I guess that's maybe okay. I hate to cut it off early if people had other questions or things, but yeah, that's basically what's going on. Is so we have 2 more Pride chats on the 17th and the 24th, and then we have Pride looks. It's a dual live on Dion's channel on the 22nd, and it is a dual live on my channel on the 29th. So that's what's coming up for Pride stuff. Thank you, everybody. Let's see if I can remember my outro before the buffering really gets out of hand. Let's do what? So apparently I don't remember my outro. So let's see if I can remember my outro. So those of you who are in chat, I would love it. Once this video becomes live again, I'm going to try to set it right away, but sometimes it takes a little while. So don't forget to come back around and leave a comment down below. Feed the beast, feed the algorithm, and replay crew, we know you rock, and especially with this one where Dion and I accidentally scheduled over each other. The replay crew, we're going to keep you busy, and we love and appreciate you, so definitely think about leaving your thoughts below so you can be part of the conversation. I'm always checking my comments. While you are down there, don't forget to give me that thumbs up to tell me that you appreciated the video, or if you are like, girl, why are you always talking about this kind of stuff? Thank you, Cheese. I'm loving it. I don't normally wear this little Brett, but it was just bugging me when it was on my forehead, so and so go ahead, if you are like, this is too much, what's all this pride, you can't spell Pride Month without demon, like that kind of shit, then go ahead and give me that thumbs down, because it's all engagement. The algorithm isn't a picky bitch, and neither am I. And while you're down there, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, become part of the Champagne Dreamers fam, and hit that bell icon so you'll be notified of all future uploads. I try really hard to make sure I have at least one video or live. And if you're lucky, if you're very lucky, you might even get a bonus video. Ooh! Pride-orific! If you'd like to chat, banter, or commiserate between uploads, all of my social media will be linked down in the description box below, including a link to my website. Just pretend it's there, The World of Champagne at JanessaJ.com. Thank you so much for watching. I love and appreciate all of you. It looks like at the end we always get some more trolls. Snapshot Sniper, we haven't slept together. You don't know what's happening anywhere. And it doesn't matter if we did. We're just talking about movies here. Good night, everyone. Happy Pride Month. Yes, Cheese, happy Pride Month. A pink unicorn. Yes, very much a pink unicorn. Starbrand Power. I bet when you stand on the scale, it reads, please get off your... Ha, ha, ha. Oh, a fat joke. I've never heard one of those before. Let's get rid of you. You're a twat. Okay. Love you guys. Talk soon. Yes, yes, yes. Burn. Yes, I know. Like, some of these people I think are children. And so, I mean, not that children should behave like that. And if you have children that act like that, you should raise them better. Just saying that to any of the people on, I know my audience, they're not raising kids like that, but, the trolls who wander in, they do like, you should raise them better. But yeah, so I hope everybody has a good night. I'm gonna take the barrette out. I'm gonna free the pink locks. And so there we go. But yeah, I hope everybody has a lovely night. And until I see you again, which will probably be next Wednesday, but I may try to work in another live. I may try to paint a face this weekend. I'm gonna see how things go. Someone says on YouTube, it's 2026, do better. Exactly. I thought you were telling me, for a second, Dawn, I didn't see I should have seen because there was the number in the crown or whatever, but I thought somebody's telling me I should do better, and I'm like, I'll be even queerer if that's what you need. But, but yeah, so I hope everybody's having a lovely, lovely time, and until I see you again, bye. The awkward ending of the stream. There it is. It's less awkward now because I sort of remember. Okay, bye.